Three of the most famous Greek philosophers, arguably the brilliant minds that undergirded our Western civilization, were didactically connected to one another. Socrates was the teacher of Plato, and Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. It may also deserve to be mentioned that Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great, but that has absolutely nothing to do with this sermon, so let it go. In the East, the two most well-known teachers were also contemporaries. Lao Tzu, who is believed to be the author of the Tao Te Ching, and Confucius, the supposed author of many fake Facebook posts. There is some talk about Lao Tzu being a teacher of Confucius. Those historical accounts tend to be more romantic than objective, however. Whether he was directly his teacher or not, though, it would be difficult to believe that Confucius was not influenced by Lao Tzu. And with apologies to women everywhere, I will add a sixth man to this list of seminal ancient thinkers, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. These six men, all of whom, other than Socrates, were quite prolific, and their recorded wisdom shaped much of human civilization. Those six guys could sit right here on the front row of our little church, and yet they have had a huge impact upon billions of people over thousands of years, largely because they all lived long enough to reflect on the meaning of their own lives and to write about it. In William Martin's, I'll admit, rather embarrassingly free interpretation of the Tao Te Ching, he writes, growing older either reveals or hides the mystery of existence. If you are becoming a sage, you will grow in trust and contentment. You will discover the light of life's deepest truths. If you are merely growing older, you will become trapped by fears and frustrations. You will see only the darkness of infirmity and death. The great task of the sage is learning to see in the darkness and not be afraid. Now, the occasion for this sermon, I'll admit, is a bit self-centered, much more so than most. I turned 63 this past week. I am now older than my father was when he retired, and though I have no personal retirement plans at this time, it's pretty clear that a man in his mid-60s is getting close to that time. It's time to be thinking about it and making some plans. Since most of the church going public is from the baby boom generation, I thought these reflections might be helpful to you as well. When Confucius reached the age of 70, he reflected on his life. At 15, I was committed to learning. At 30, I took my rightful position. At 40, I was no longer totally perplexed. At 50, I began to understand the unfurling of my true nature. At 60, I was in harmony with contradictions and ambivalence. At 70, at long last, I may follow my heart's desires without going astray. In our youth-oriented culture, it's helpful to realize that wisdom doesn't come until late in life, if it comes at all. As our joints begin to fail us and our strength ebbs, it's possible to think only morbidly about growing older and realizing that we are all closer and closer to our death. But the wisdom of the ancients calls on us to not despise our aging, but to dive into it, as if we are now freed from the impulsive appetites of our youth. It is possible for us, as Confucius said, to follow our heart's desires without being led into self-destructive behaviors, if we have in fact become a sage, such that our desires are for wisdom and integrity, that we can find a deeper and more meaningful way of living. Soren Kierkegaard said that we all live like a ship's captain that sets sail with sealed orders. That is, you may have a plan. You may think you know how you want your life to go, but it virtually never does. Life rarely follows our original plan. I want for all of us to live beyond our regrets, but we would hardly be honest if we did not acknowledge that we've got regrets. The religious beliefs that made me go to seminary as a young man in the late 1970s evaporated fairly quickly in the bright light of the academic study of faith and theology. Actually, being a minister was nothing like what I thought it was going to be. For that matter, being married was nothing like what I thought it was going to be. I do regret that I never managed to create a mutually meaningful marriage relationship. I regret that I was not more cautious, that I wasn't more wise when I made those choices. And I regret that I was not more sophisticated in my relationship problem-solving skills. There are some years of my life that I would love to be able to do over, to make different choices, to be more patient, to be more personally disclosive, to be more careful in the choices I made and who I trusted, who I accepted into my inner circle of friends and associations. However, as Ben Franklin famously said, we only learn when we are uncomfortable. My personal experience of marriage was a 16-year-long toothache. But that abysmal marriage, without it, I would not have been in a position to adopt my favorite person in the world. Whatever price was to be paid for becoming Valerie's father was a bargain, and I'd do it again. The end of my career in the denomination of my birth revealed the hypocrisy and hubris of organized religion and laid bare some of the base motivations of false friends and associates. But as traumatic as 2007 was for me, my daughter, for a whole lot of other people, it was the trauma that set me free to become who I am. It set in motion the creation of this church and allowed me to give full-throated voice to a progressive vision of faith that has drawn an audience of thousands of seekers who also want to meaningfully live a life of faith beyond the crude superstitions of antiquity and the corruption of organized religion. Almost every sermon that I have delivered here over the last 11 years would have gotten me immediately fired in any other church I ever worked for. So, in some ways, as much as I hate to say it, being fired in 2007 was like being let out of prison. One of the most important metaphors, though, the resurrection narratives in the Gospels, particularly in the Gospel of John, is that when the dead body of Jesus was brought back to life, he was not healed of his wounds. He still had the scars in his body. There was still a spear wound in his side and holes in his hands from the nails. There are things that happen to us, folks, that don't heal. There are things that don't get better. Ask anyone who has lost a child how long it's going to take them to get over it. There are things you don't get over. There are wounds that you carry with you, but they become a part of us. And they can become our teachers. Unlike many of my religious peers, unlike almost all of them, I vehemently disagree with the baseless claim that everything happens for a reason. It doesn't. I do not believe that God is a supernatural puppet master who is in control of the events of human history. I believe that the universe is capricious, that it is chaotic, and that most stuff happens while it follows the observable laws of physics and nature. Still, most stuff just happens. Now, the human factor can hurt or help that capricious unfolding of events in life, but that bumper sticker that was popular a generation ago that boldly proclaimed that Stuff happens. That's true. Stuff just happens. But those bad things, the bad things that happen to you, they can convince you that you're a victim, that the world's been unfair to you, that you're unlucky, that you've been mistreated. Those things can make you afraid. They can rob you of joy, and yet, ironically, make you afraid of dying. Some of the most miserable people I've ever known in my life were horrified when their time came to die. And I think, if I were you, I'd look forward to that. But those same events can become like Socrates to you. Socrates was known as the philosophical gadfly. That is, he kept people from being comfortable with their assumptions. He asked hard questions. He kept pricking them like a fly that just keeps biting you to make you think, to push you towards deeper understanding, towards maturity, hopefully towards wisdom and insight. There is tremendous pressure in our world, in every walk of life, in every career field. There is tremendous pressure towards mediocrity, to be a conformist, towards sameness and compliance. If you stick your head and shoulders up above the crowd, somebody will hand your head back to you on a platter. Now, there are 1,000 wonderful quotes from the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, but I chose this kind of edgy one today. The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself among the ranks of the crazy. Because while a certain amount of social conformity, being cooperative, being compliant, might be expected of young people who are getting started in life, they've got to pay a certain amount of dues. They've got to spend some time in school learning how to wait for their turn. We teach kids in public school how to stand in line. But folks, as I am now getting old, I believe that a big part of being a senior citizen is getting out of line, learning how to get out of line in a meaningful way. I understand that there are people who found themselves in careers that were not personally meaningful to them. They traded the hours of their days for enough money to pay for a house and car and food. And so as soon as they could, they retired. I get that. I have the enviable position of having the most meaningful career, where I get to do what means the most to me almost every day. But for everyone, when you think about retiring, retire to do what? Is it just that you're going to stop going to work? Is it to play golf every day, to sit in a rocker, to yell at the kids, "Get off of my lawn"? Lao Tzu, Confucius, Marcus Aurelius, and to a large extent Plato and Aristotle didn't talk to us about growing old gracefully and quietly getting out of the way. They encouraged us to continually become people of substance, to pursue wisdom, and once it's attained, to use it to make the world a better place. The sage, the gentleman or gentlewoman that Confucius talks about, the philosopher that Plato and Aristotle talk about, are not supposed to attain wisdom just to bottle it up. Now, I get why people allow themselves to wonder aloud about whether Biden or Sanders or Warren or Trump, for that matter, may be too old to be the president. Age can slow down your mental functions, and senility or dementia can be aspects of aging. But come on, really? Is Trump that different than he was when he was 30? Hey, is age the issue? Biden was sticking his foot in his mouth back in the 70s. This is not new behavior for him. You cannot blame the number of years that he's lived for the way that he acts. And conversely, Pete Buttigieg, the Harvard-educated combat veteran, that guy is really smart. He is extraordinarily well-spoken. And yet, when I was finishing my doctorate at Vanderbilt, Mayor Pete was still riding his big wheel in his mama's driveway. If he were to become America's first openly gay president, I would be thrilled about that. Honestly, I would. But I would be a lot more thrilled if it happened in 2028 than if it happens in 2020. I don't pick green tomatoes out of my garden and set them on the kitchen counter to ripen. I let them stay right there on the vine until I'm ready to introduce them to some mayonnaise and lettuce. You can be very smart in your 30s, but who is the youngest wise person that you've ever personally known? I'll bet you they weren't in their 30s. Now, I'll acknowledge an exception. Martin Luther King Jr. was just 35 when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, and he was only 39 when he was murdered. And I'll just say this. One of my professors at Harvard was a personal friend to Martin Luther King, and I did a course in religious biography at Harvard, and we talked a lot about the fact that Martin Luther King was being destroyed by his appetites, that he had not just some affairs, he had lots of affairs. He drank alcoholically. He attempted suicide a few times. He had not ripened. He was pushed. He was literally recruited and pushed onto a public stage during the bus boycott in Montgomery. He wasn't ready. Brilliant, world-changing figure. But who might he have been if he had been allowed to live for another generation? If we had known Martin Luther King as a 63-year-old man and not simply remembered him as a 39-year-old man. If Gandhi had died at 39, no one here would have ever heard of him. If Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Lao Tzu, or Confucius had died at 39, we would have never heard of them. If Marcus Aurelius had died at 39, he would have a name on a list of Caesars of the Roman Empire, and that would be 100% of what anybody here knew about him. Movie stars, athletes, and models might peak when they are in their 20s or early 30s, but not sages, not statesmen, not philosophers. I personally miss the days when I ran mini marathons and then went to an all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet like it was a personal challenge. No one should eat all you can eat. But I liked to see Sun Yat-sen back in the corner with a little tear in his eye when I left. But every age of life has its virtues. It has taken you your whole life to get this smart. For those of us who now get a discount on our movie tickets and our McDonald's coffee, now is the time not for you to go into hiding, but for you to use your wisdom to make the world a better place.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.